Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My world is a symphony of white. Not the soft, gentle white of a fresh snowfall in a quiet suburb, but a hard, ancient, and deeply hostile white. It is the white of the polar ice cap, a continent of frozen, compressed time that groans and shifts with a power that is utterly indifferent to the small, fragile lives of men. My name is Stellan, and for the past 4 years, my job has been to navigate this world. I am the first mate on the Polaris, an icebreaker that carves a precarious, temporary path for the supply ships that feed the research stations of Antarctica. It is a life lived at the very edge of the map, in a place where the rules of the normal world do not apply. The cold here is not a temperature, it is a presence. It is a physical entity that steals the breath from your lungs and freezes the moisture in your eyes. The sun is a fickle, distant god, appearing for a few brief, glorious weeks before abandoning us to months of perpetual twilight gloom. The isolation is the most profound I have ever known. We are a small crew of 12 men, a tiny, still bubble of warmth and noise in a universe of absolute, crushing silence. We are closer than brothers, and yet we are all profoundly alone, each man carrying the weight of the life he left behind, the life that is the only reason he is here. A man does not choose this life for the adventure. He does not choose it for the stark, brutal beauty of the landscape. He chooses it because the price of admission to this white hell is a paycheck that can, with enough time and enough sacrifice, buy a small piece of heaven back home. My heaven had a name, and that name was Cora, my wife. She was the contrast to my white world. She was color and warmth and life. Her image, a photograph that lived in a waterproof zippered pocket over my heart, was my most sacred text. It was a picture of us, taken on our wedding day 5 years ago. Her smile in that photo was the sun I did not see for months at a time. It was the heat that kept the cold in my own heart from becoming permanent. Our love story was a beautiful, tragic, and deeply unfair one. We had 2 perfect years together, 2 years of a simple, happy, and deeply ordinary life. And then the sickness came. It was a rare, insidious, and cruel disease of the nervous system, a 1 in a million diagnosis that had no known cause and no known cure. It was a slow, degenerative process, a thief that was gradually, methodically stealing the vibrant, energetic woman I had married, leaving a stranger in her place, a woman trapped in a body that was increasingly alien to her. The disease was a storm that had descended upon our small, happy harbor, and it threatened to sink everything. But then there was a flicker of hope. A doctor, a specialist at a renowned clinic in Switzerland, was pioneering an experimental treatment. It was not a cure, but it offered a chance to halt the progression, to reclaim some of what had been lost. The treatment was unproven, it was radical, and it was astronomically expensive. The cost was a number so vast, so overwhelming, that it was not a medical bill, it was a life sentence. Our insurance called it experimental and refused to cover it. We were on our own. I was a man who had spent his life building things, a naval architect who had designed the very kind of ships that now plied these frozen waters. I knew how to solve problems with physics and engineering. But this problem, this monstrous financial dragon, was beyond my skill set. So I made a choice, the only choice I could. I sold my share in the small firm I had helped to build. I cashed in my retirement. I took the most difficult, most dangerous, and most ludicrously high-paying job on the planet. I became a man who breaks ice so that I could pay for a miracle. Our life became a long-distance, high-stakes partnership. I was the engine, the brute force, working in this frozen white hell to generate the capital. She was the patient, the warrior, enduring the grueling, painful, and exhausting treatments at the exclusive, high-tech wellness center on the shores of Lake Geneva. The clinic, from the picture she sent, was a beautiful, serene place, a palace of glass and light, a stark contrast to my world of gray steel and ice. Her letters, which arrived in sporadic, bundled deliveries with the supply ships, were my lifeline. They were filled with a mixture of hope and hardship. She described the treatments in vague, clinical terms I didn't fully understand. The neuroregenerative infusions, the cryostimulation, the bioresonant therapies. She wrote of the small victories, a day with less pain, an evening of restful sleep. And she wrote of her love for me, a love that was, she said, the ultimate fuel for her fight. "I know what you are doing for me, my love," she wrote in one letter, her elegant, familiar script a splash of impossible color in my monochrome world. "I know the sacrifice you are making. Every time I feel the medicine flowing into my veins, I think of you out there in the cold. You are not just breaking the ice, Stellan. You are breaking a path for me back to life. You are my hero." I would read those words in the cramped, noisy confines of my bunk, the roar of the ship's engines a constant, deafening hum, and I would feel a sense of purpose so profound it was almost a physical pain. This was not a job. This was a holy war, and we were going to win. I was a ghost in her battle. I knew the name of her primary physician, a Dr. Alastair Finch, a man she described as a brilliant, compassionate genius. I had spoken to him on the phone once, a brief, stilted conversation where he had assured me in a calm Swiss-German accent that they were doing everything possible. I had never met him. I had never seen the clinic. I was the silent, invisible partner, the man whose only function was to sign the wire transfers that kept the entire, miraculous machine running. For 4 years, this was my life. 4 years of the perpetual, grinding winter, of the crushing loneliness, of the brief, glorious summers where the sun would circle the horizon without setting, a mad, sleepless god. I lost track of time. The world outside of my white continent, the world of politics and seasons and normal life, ceased to be real. The only things that were real were the ice, the ship, my love for Cora, and the ever-dwindling number of the medical debt in my mental ledger. The satellite communication system on the Polaris was a notoriously fickle beast, a temperamental god that we relied on for our only connection to the outside world. It was primarily for official ship's business and weather data, but we were allowed a small, precious bandwidth for personal emails. The system was prone to glitches, to strange atmospheric delays. Messages would sometimes arrive out of order, or days, even weeks late, like digital ghosts from the past. It was one of these glitches that destroyed my world. It was the middle of the Antarctic winter, a period of perpetual, unrelenting darkness we called the Long Night. We were pushing through a particularly thick stretch of ice, the ship groaning and shuddering with each impact. I was in the small, closet-sized communications room trying to download a new ice flow chart when a new email popped into my personal inbox. The subject line was blank. The sender was Cora. The email itself contained a single, small, and obviously misdirected attachment. It was an audio file. I clicked on it, assuming it was one of the audio letters she sometimes sent, her voice a warm, precious commodity in my silent world. I put on the headphones to block out the roar of the ship. I expected to hear her voice, telling me about her day, about her treatment. But the voice that came through the headphones was not Cora's. It was a man's voice, a voice with a familiar Swiss-German accent, Dr. Finch, and he was not talking about medicine. The final transfer came through, he was saying, his voice a low, intimate murmur. Our St. Bernard in the Antarctic is even more reliable than we had hoped. The last of the construction loans are paid off. The West Wing is officially ours. There was a pause, and then I heard her voice, and the sound of it, the pure, unadulterated joy in it, was a sound I had not heard in years. "Ours," she repeated, and she laughed, a high, musical, and utterly carefree sound. I liked the sound of that. To us, Alistair, to the Finchthorn Wellness Retreat and Spa. Finchthorn. Thorn was a maiden name. There was a clinking of glasses. To us, my love, he said, and to your brilliant, tragic, and incredibly lucrative illness. The audio file ended. It was just 30 seconds long. 30 seconds of a conversation that was not meant for me. 30 seconds of a misdirected audio note that was, I now knew with a certainty that was as cold and as hard as the ice surrounding the ship, not a mistake. It was a message. My mind, the engineer's mind, which was used to dealing in the hard, unforgiving logic of physics, refused to process it. The words were a foreign language, a code I could not decipher. Wellness retreat and spa. Construction loans. Her brilliant, tragic, and incredibly lucrative illness. It was a ghost signal, a message from a parallel universe where every single fact of my life was a lie. I played the file again, and again, and again. I sat there in the small, dark room, the only light the green glow of the radar screen, and I listened to the sound of my own life being systematically and joyfully dismantled. There was no illness. There was no experimental treatment. There was no compassionate genius doctor. There was a spa, a luxury hotel on a Swiss lake, and my wife and her lover, the doctor, were its proud owners. And I, Stellan, the hero, the man who was breaking ice and sacrificing his life for a miracle, I was the Saint Bernard, the dumb, loyal, and incredibly useful animal sent out into the storm to bring back the money that had paid for their dream. The last 4 years of my life, the sacrifice, the loneliness, the cold, the darkness, it was all a business plan, a brilliant, diabolical, and perfectly executed fraud, and I had been its most devoted and most foolish employee. The ship shuddered as it hit a particularly large floe of ice, the impact a jarring physical blow that seemed to shake the very foundations of my soul. I looked out the porthole. There was nothing but the endless, eternal, and unforgiving white. And for the first time, the landscape outside was a perfect reflection of the landscape within, a frozen, empty, and desolate wasteland. The 30 seconds of that audio file became a new kind of polar night, a darkness that settled in my soul and did not lift. For the first few days, I was a machine, a hollowed-out man performing his duties on a kind of numb, biological autopilot. I checked the engine pressure. I monitored the fuel consumption. I stood my watch on the bridge, staring out at the endless, indifferent ice. My crewmates, men I had lived with in close quarters for years, noticed the change. They saw the new, dead stillness in my eyes, the way my face had become a blank, expressionless mask. They attributed it to the crushing, cumulative effect of the long winter, to a bad case of the polar madness. They gave me a wide, respectful berth. They had no idea that the ice I was navigating was not outside the ship, but within me. The engineer in me, the part that could not be killed by grief or rage, demanded data. The audio file was a single, catastrophic data point. But it was not enough. I needed to understand the full scope of the lie, the entire, detailed architecture of my own ruin. I became a different kind of explorer. My mission was no longer to break a path through the ice. It was to drill down, to take a core sample of the last 4 years of my life and to analyze its layers of deception. My only tool was the ship's fickle, low-bandwidth satellite connection, my only window into a world that was now a crime scene. I started with the name, the Finchthorn Wellness Retreat and Spa. I typed it into the search engine, and there it was, a sleek, professional website full of breathtaking photographs of a modern glass and timber building nestled on the shores of Lake Geneva. It was a palace of luxury. The website described it as a holistic sanctuary for the discerning traveler, a place to rejuvenate the mind, body, and spirit. It offered yoga retreats, gourmet vegan cuisine, and a full menu of spa treatments. There was no mention of any medical services, no mention of any experimental treatments for a rare neurological disease. It was a hotel, a beautiful, exclusive, and breathtakingly expensive hotel. The About Us page featured a professional, smiling photograph of its two founders, Dr. Alistair Finch, a pioneer in holistic wellness, and Cora Thorne, an internationally recognized patient advocate and design consultant. She was using her maiden name. She was not the patient. She was the co-owner. I scrolled through the photo gallery. I saw pictures of the infinity pool, the yoga pavilion, the serene minimalist guest rooms. And then I saw a picture of her. It was a candid shot, a photo from a guest testimonial section. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her hair catching the golden Swiss sunlight. She was standing on a terrace, a glass of champagne in her hand. She was not just healthy, she was vibrant, she was radiant. She was a woman who had never been sick a day in her life. The photograph was a dagger. I had a picture of my own, the one in my locker, the one that had been my icon, my symbol of hope. It was a picture of a woman from 5 years ago. This woman in the new photograph was a stranger, a beautiful, laughing, triumphant stranger who was living a life I had paid for but had no part in. The lie was not just that she wasn't sick. The lie was that she had been suffering at all. She had not been enduring a painful treatment. She had been overseeing a construction project. She had not been a patient. She had been an entrepreneur. The letters she had written me, the ones filled with her struggles and her small victories, were not missives from a hospital bed. They were works of fiction, written from the comfort of a luxury spa, likely while sitting on that very same terrace. I spent the next weeks of the long, dark winter engaged in a new kind of work. Every spare moment, I was in the communications room, a digital archaeologist, painstakingly excavating the ruins of my own life. I hacked into our old joint bank accounts. It was surprisingly easy. The security questions were all based on a shared past that was, I now knew, a complete fabrication. What was the name of your first pet? What was the street you grew up on? I answered the questions, and the doors to our shared financial history swung open. The numbers told a story that was even more damning than the photographs. I saw my massive bi-weekly paychecks appearing in the account. And I saw the money flowing out, not in the small, irregular increments of medical bills, but in huge, round, and regular payments to a Swiss construction firm, to a high-end architectural designer, to a supplier of luxury hotel linens. I was not paying for her treatment. I was paying for her inventory. I was the angel investor in her boutique hotel. The rage I felt was a cold, quiet, and deeply efficient thing. It did not make me want to scream or break things. It made me want to calculate. It made me want to build. I began to download everything, every bank statement, every email she had ever sent me from the clinic. I took screenshots of the spa's website, of the photos of her, of the glowing reviews from its wealthy clientele. I was compiling a dossier, a meticulous, undeniable, and utterly devastating record of her fraud. The work was my only solace. It was a familiar process. It was like designing a ship. I was gathering the data, calculating the stress loads, drawing the blueprints. But the structure I was designing was not a vessel of steel. It was a cage of her own making. The question of what to do with this information was a constant, low-grade hum in the back of my mind. The man I had been, the man who had loved her, was dead. But the man who was left was not a killer. I did not want to destroy her. I did not want revenge. Not in the hot, simple sense of the word. What I wanted was restitution. I wanted the truth to be known. And I wanted my life back. Not the life I had shared with her, which was now a toxic, radioactive wasteland, but the years of my own life that I had sacrificed, that I had converted into currency to fund her lie. I wanted my pound of flesh, not in blood, but in cold, hard, and legally justifiable cash. The final piece of my puzzle, the detail that would transform my private investigation into a public indictment, came from a source I did not expect. One of the other engineers on the ship, a grizzled old Norwegian named Bjorn, was a man who had spent 40 years in the Arctic. He was a man who understood the strange, distorted nature of life at the poles. One night, as we shared a thermos of coffee on the bridge, I asked him a hypothetical question. I told him a story about a friend whose wife was receiving an experimental treatment that required all of their communications to be routed through a special encrypted medical channel. I asked him if a message, an audio file, could be accidentally misdirected from a private encrypted channel to a standard open one. Bjorn looked at me with his pale, watery, and incredibly wise eyes. "There are no accidents with an encrypted signal, Stellan," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Especially not on a military-grade satellite system like the one that Clinic would use. To move a file from one channel to another, that requires a deliberate, manual override. Someone has to unlock it and reroute it. It is not a glitch, it is an action." The final, chilling piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The audio file had not been a mistake. It had not been a careless slip-up. It had been a deliberate act. But by who? Not Cora, not Alistair. They had no reason to expose themselves. Someone else. Someone on the inside of their perfect Swiss paradise. Someone who had wanted me to know the truth. Who? A disgruntled employee? A rival? I went back to the spa's website. I looked at the staff page. I looked at the smiling, professional faces of the yoga instructors, the massage therapists, the gourmet chefs. And then I saw a name that was not a stranger's. Dr. Annalise Weber, Chief Financial Officer. I remembered the name from a single, angry email I had found in Cora's account. An email from a year ago where she had complained about a difficult new hire in accounting who was asking too many questions. Annalise Weber. I did a search for her, and I found it. She was Alistair Finch's ex-wife, the wife he had left for Cora, the woman whose own life had been destroyed by their affair. And she was the one person in their organization who had the access, the motive, and the cold, quiet fury to send me a single 30-second audio file. She had not sent it to me to be cruel. She had sent it to me as a weapon. She had armed me with the truth. And she was waiting, I now knew, for me to fire the shot. The ship was finally turning north. Our long, dark winter was ending. We were heading home. But the home I was heading towards was not the one I had left. I was not going back to a wife. I was going back to a target. And I was no longer the Saint Bernard, the dumb, loyal beast of burden. I was the hunter. And I had the scent. The journey home was a period of intense, silent preparation. The roar of the ship's engines was the soundtrack to my own quiet and methodical retooling. I was a weapon that was being sharpened, calibrated, and aimed. The grief and the shock had been burned away, leaving behind a core of cold, hard, and utterly clear purpose. I was not just a man who had been wronged. I was an engineer, and I was facing the most complex and most personal structural problem of my life. I had to design a demolition of a lie. But it had to be a controlled demolition. A loud, messy, emotional confrontation would be a messy, emotional failure. It would give Cora the stage to play the flawed, repentant, but ultimately sympathetic victim. It would give her a drama to perform in. I would not give her that satisfaction. My approach would be the same as the one I would use to bring down a condemned building. A series of precise, calculated, and strategically placed charges, designed to bring the entire structure down in on itself, with a minimum of collateral damage. My first charge was Annalise Weber, Alistair's ex-wife, the ghost who had sent me the audio file. She was my inside source, my unwilling and likely unknowing ally. I needed to make contact. From the ship, using a heavily encrypted satellite phone that was technically for emergency use only, I sent her a single anonymous email. The subject line was Prudhoe Bay. The body of the email contained only a set of coordinates, the coordinates of a specific remote ice flow we had passed weeks before, and a single sentence. Some business partnerships are built on very thin ice. It was a message that would be meaningless to anyone but her. It was a signal from the St. Bernard. It was a way of telling her that her message had been received and that the long Arctic winter of her own silence was, perhaps, about to end. Her reply came 24 hours later. It was equally cryptic. "The weather in Geneva is unpredictable," it read, "but the forecast is for a significant and potentially damaging thaw. A good engineer prepares for such things." The communication was established. We were two ghosts communicating across a vast distance, united by a single common enemy, the thaw. That was the perfect metaphor. The lie Cora and Alistair had built was a beautiful, glittering ice palace. But it was built on a warming sea, and the thaw was coming. My second charge was legal. I needed a weapon, and in the civilized world, the most effective weapon is a good lawyer. Through Annalise, who, it turned out, had her own very discreet and very aggressive legal team in Zurich, I retained the services of a firm that specialized in high-stakes international financial fraud. From the middle of the Barents Sea, I held a series of encrypted video conferences with a man named Mr. Kessler, a lawyer with a face like a hawk and a mind like a steel trap. I transmitted my entire dossier to him. The bank statements, the emails, the screenshots, the audio file. I gave him the full, detailed blueprint of the fraud. Kessler was not interested in my pain. He was interested in the numbers. He saw the clear, undeniable trail of my money, my labor, flowing directly into their pockets. He saw the breach of contract. He saw the fraud. And his eyes, even on the grainy, pixelated video feed, glittered with the cold, predatory joy of a shark that has just scented blood in the water. The plan he devised was a masterpiece of legal, financial, and psychological warfare. We would not file a lawsuit immediately. That would be too noisy, too predictable. Instead, we would execute a silent, devastating financial ambush. On the day of my return, the moment I set foot on dry land in Norway, Kessler's firm would file a series of ex-parte applications in the Swiss courts. They would petition a judge, in secret, to freeze every single one of their assets. The spa's operating accounts, their personal bank accounts, their investment portfolios, even the deed to the property itself. We would present the judge with the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence of the fraud. The goal was to turn off the power, to cut the supply lines, to financially paralyze them without a single word of warning. They would wake up one morning to find that their entire glittering world had been put on ice. My third and final charge was personal. It was the most difficult and the most necessary. It was the message I had to deliver to Cora myself. Not a message of anger, not a message of hate, a message of finality. The day before the ship was due to dock, I composed the email. I wrote it and rewrote it a dozen times. It had to be perfect. It had to be a blade, not a club. It had to be the final, single, quiet gunshot that would signal the end of the war. Cora, it began. For 4 years, I have lived in a white world, a world of ice and silence, sustained by the belief that I was fighting for your life. I have just learned that the life I was fighting for was not yours, but your and Alistair's. The illness was a lie. The clinic is a hotel. and my sacrifice was the business plan for your shared dream. I have the bank records. I have the construction invoices. I have the audio file. I have the truth. This is not an accusation. It is a statement of fact. My lawyers will be in touch. They will handle the liquidation of the assets. My share is the exact sum of my earnings for the last 4 years, plus interest. It is not alimony. It is restitution. The rest you can have. Consider it a severance payment for the good years. I wish you nothing. Not happiness, not misery. Just nothing. The space where my love for you used to be is now as empty and as white as the continent I am just now leaving. Goodbye, Stellan. I hit send. And as the email disappeared into the ether, I felt a profound and final sense of release. The weight I had been carrying, the weight of the lie, of the love, of the hate, it all just lifted. I was no longer a husband. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a ghost. I was just a man, at the end of a very long, very hard job. The day we docked in Tromsø, the world seemed impossibly, ridiculously colorful. The red of the houses, the blue of the deep, cold fjord, the green of the mountains that rose up from the sea. I walked off that ship with a single duffel bag, the same one I had boarded with 4 years ago. I was a different man. The man who had boarded that ship was a man driven by love and a desperate, hopeful faith. The man who was walking away was a man who believed only in the hard, cold, and strangely liberating truth. As I walked towards the city, my phone buzzed. It was a single, encrypted text message from Kessler. It contained only one word: frozen. The thaw had begun. The ice palace was beginning to crack, and I was walking, for the first time in a very long time, into the sun. The world after the demolition is a quiet place. For a month, I stayed in a small, quiet town on the coast of Norway, a place of fishing boats and the smell of salt and pine. I did nothing. I simply was. I was a man in a decompression chamber, slowly, carefully reacclimatizing to the pressure of a normal atmosphere. I walked. I read books. I sat in small cafes and watched the world go by. A world that was no longer a distant, theoretical concept, but a real, tangible, and blessedly mundane thing. The legal and financial fallout from my silent ambush was a distant, clinical affair, managed entirely by Kessler and his team. I would receive daily encrypted updates. They were like battlefield reports from a war I had started but was no longer fighting. The asset freeze had been a complete success. Cora and Alistair were financially paralyzed. Their beautiful, exclusive spa, unable to pay its staff or its suppliers, had been forced to close its doors. Its serene, minimalist rooms now empty and silent. The legal case against them for fraud was overwhelming. Faced with the mountain of evidence, they had no defense. Annalise Weber, the ghost who had started it all, had provided Kessler with a sworn affidavit, a detailed, insider's account of their entire conspiracy, from its inception to its execution. She was not a witness for the prosecution out of any love for me, but out of a cold, calculated, and perfectly executed revenge of her own. The final settlement was a quiet, brutal, and unconditional surrender. They agreed to all of my terms. The corporation that owned the spa was to be dissolved. The property itself, the beautiful palace of glass and light on the shores of Lake Geneva, was to be sold. From the proceeds of that sale, my restitution, the full sum of my 4 years of earnings, plus interest, plus all legal fees, was to be paid to me first. The remainder, if there was any, would be theirs to divide. It was a financial annihilation, a controlled demolition of the entire empire they had built on the bedrock of my life. My role in all of it was that of a silent, remote observer. I signed the documents digitally. I did not have to see them. I did not have to speak to them. My final, devastating message had been delivered, and their silence in response was the only answer I needed. One day, about a month after the settlement, I received a final, forwarded email from Kessler. It was from a public email address. It was from Cora. The subject line was my name, Stellan.
The email itself was long. It was a rambling, chaotic, and deeply pathetic attempt at an explanation, at a justification. It was a story of a woman who had felt trapped, who had seen an opportunity, who had made a series of small, compromising choices that had led, inevitably, to a single monstrous one. It was full of self-pity, of regret, of a strange, twisted kind of love for the man she had so completely and so thoroughly destroyed. "I know you will never forgive me," she wrote at the end. "I do not ask you to. I only want you to know that the man in the photograph, the man who loved me before all of this, was real. I was real then. And it is the ghost of that woman who is writing to you now, and who is, and will always be, profoundly and completely sorry." I read the email once, and then I dragged it to the trash, and I emptied the trash. She was right about one thing. I would never forgive her. But I had discovered, in the quiet, sunlit days of my new, empty life, that forgiveness was not necessary for my own healing. What was necessary was release, and I had released her. I had released the love, the hate, the memory, the ghost. She was no longer a part of my system. She was just a piece of deleted data. My own future was a blank page. The money, a substantial sum that could have allowed me to never work another day in my life, sat in a Swiss bank account, untouched. It felt like blood money. It was the price of my own life, and I did not know what to do with it. The answer came to me not in a flash of inspiration, but in a quiet conversation with the old fisherman who owned the guest house where I was staying. He was a man whose hands were a testament to a lifetime of hard, honest work, whose face was a map of the same winds and seas I had known. He told me about his son, a young man who had been a brilliant marine biologist, a man who had dreamed of creating a foundation to study the fragile and rapidly changing ecosystem of the Arctic. A young man who had died 2 years earlier, his research vessel lost in a sudden, violent storm in the Barents Sea, the same sea I had just crossed. That night, I made a phone call to a different kind of lawyer, a man who specialized in philanthropy. I gave him my instructions. I wanted to create a foundation, the Stellan Thorne Arctic Research Foundation. It was a fusion of my name and her maiden name, a final, quiet, and strangely appropriate mingling of our two now separate histories. The foundation's purpose would be to fund the kind of research that the fisherman's son had dreamed of, to study the ice, to understand the thaw. The entire sum of my settlement, every single franc, was to be its endowment. It was not an act of charity. It was an act of repurposing. I was taking the money that had been earned in the darkness and the cold, and I was using it to bring a little more light and a little more knowledge to that same desolate and beautiful part of the world. It was a way of transforming the poison into a kind of medicine. I did not stay to oversee the foundation. I was not a scientist. I was not an administrator. I was an engineer. I was a man who knew how to work with his hands. I left Norway. I bought a one-way ticket to a small coastal town in Maine, and I found a job, a quiet, honest job. I work in a small, independent boatyard designing and building custom wooden sailboats. The work is slow, it is meticulous, it is real. My hands are stained now, not with grease, but with sawdust and varnish. The roar of the icebreaker has been replaced by the quiet scrape of a hand plane on cedar, the gentle lapping of the tide against the shore. I live in a small apartment above the boatyard. I have a dog. I am, for the first time in my life, truly and completely at peace.
I have built a new life, a small, sturdy, and seaworthy vessel, not out of the wreckage of my past, but out of the lessons it taught me. And sometimes, on a clear, cold night, I look out over the dark, quiet water, and I think of the ice, a world away. And I know that I am no longer its prisoner. I am just a man who was once lost in the white, and who has, finally, and against all odds, found his way home. Before you go, I have to ask, what was the moment someone's mask fell off in your life? Share it in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Reddit Whispers for more jaw-dropping true stories.